In this lecture, we're going to look at a subject that's utterly intertwined with stress, which is pain. And this is bidirectional. Stress can cause you to change your sensitivity to pain. Pain constitutes a stressor. We're going to look at the interaction between the two. Okay, by now you know the drill sufficiently so that they could come in here and deflate me and put me in a storage closet, and you could leap right in and go through the dichotomy: short-term, stress response is good news, bad long-term, it's bad news. As we're going to see, the biology of pain, this is the one exception. All right, so we start off with pain. We all hate pain. Pain's a great thing to get rid of. Pain is bad news. Pain is remarkably good news and remarkably helpful when it's occurring at the right time. You generally want some sort of signal coming from the periphery saying, ooh, my big toe is in the fire there. This might be a good time to move it backwards. You need pain signaling you in circumstances where you can fix the situation. And there is a terrible disease where people are born, a rare one, without the ability to feel pain. And what you get is all sorts of things go wrong, even to the extent of these are people who damage their legs, damage their knees because they don't get the pain feedback telling how much force you should be descending a flight of stairs with. So pain is wonderful when it's occurring in a circumstance where you can actually change your behavior and decrease the source of damage. And as we would well know, when it's circumstances where there's nothing you can do, pain is a misery. Pain is a nightmare. So how does it work? Shifting over to the biology of pain so that we can then appreciate what it is that stress does, pain is actually quite well understood. It starts off with all sorts of outposts in your body, all sorts of sentinels, all sorts of sensors that pick up when something is going wrong. And this could be on the level of your skin. It could be on the level of muscles when you have muscle pain. It could be in various organs when suddenly you have a stomach ache, when suddenly something else feels more serious. In all these cases, what you have to have is something is responsive to a pain signal out there, and it is then able to send that information to your spinal cord and up to your brain, and there you go. So what you have to have are pain sensors. And pain comes in all sorts of different forms. You have sensors, for example, that are sensitive to extreme heat. They will pick up a signal of heat somewhere on your skin, wherever it's relevant, and these receptors, these neurons, these brain cells, these are brain cells out in your skin. This is your nervous system sending projections everywhere. You have these specialized heat-sensitive neurons that pick up that heat, activate, and send the signal on down. Meanwhile, not surprisingly, you have other receptive neurons that do just the opposite. They're sensitive to cold. Meanwhile, there are other ones that are sensitive to pressure, extreme pressure. Ouch, somebody is squeezing your hand. So pressure transducing neurons there, which take that sort of signal and turn that into a different sort of pain perception. There's even pain neurons that respond to things like you've just gotten cut. And this is really a weird one when you think about it. There are certain chemicals which are found inside your cells. And as a general rule, if they're found outside the cells, that's a bad sign because something has sliced that cell open. And as a result of the innards of that cell spilling out, that particular chemical binds to a receptor in another cell nearby and sends a signal, we've been cut. Why is that bizarre? Because what that winds up meaning is when you accidentally get a paper cut and it hurts, you literally are slicing some cells in there in half where they are spilling out their guts. So different types of pain. Very interestingly, there turns out to be an additional type of pain, and this is one that initially seems metaphorical and turns out to be much more literal. You are eating wildly spicy food to the point where it hurts. You've got sweat running down your nose, and you're taking great pleasure in this. Very spicy food hurts. And spice is mediated by a chemical found in spicy food called capsaicin. And people long wondered why spicy food at an extreme can hurt. why spicy food tastes hot. And remarkably, it turns out that this capsaicin, this chemical found in hot peppers, actually activates some of those hot receptor neurons. Spicy food that is hot is literally activating a hot pain system. So how does this work once you've gotten past these receptors? Once you've gotten past that first phase, how is it now processed in your spinal cord on up to your brain? And to appreciate this, we need to shift over to a diagram that's in your guidebook, one that is the dominating model in the field. Wonderful, wonderful insight as to how this system works. In this diagram, we start with part A, up on top. And what we've got are projections of neurons talking to other neurons. Do not panic. This is highly schematic. None of your neurons look this way. What we have is a neuron sitting there in the middle, the one marked X, which sends a projection to the brain. This neuron is sitting in your spinal cord. And when it is stimulated, it sends a signal telling your brain that there's something painful happening. So when does it get stimulated? And you see there are the projections above and below neuron X, those lines coming from neurons somewhere to the left of this diagram. What sort of neurons are those? Those are the pain sentinels. Those are the cold responsive, hot responsive, pressure responsive. So there's two different types of pathways that could wind up stimulating that neuron X. First one, shown up on top, mediates sudden pain. And we see that projection coming from the imaginary neuron on top to the left, its cell body, projecting, sending this cable-like projection to neuron X. And what it does there is it stimulates neuron X. When the neuron that mediates sudden pain gets activated, it stimulates and activates neuron X. Meanwhile, down below in the same diagram, you've got a slow pain pathway, and that's coming from a different type of pain receptive neuron, which activates in response to a painful stimulus, activates that pathway, which stimulates neuron X also. And soon, your brain gets information that something painful has occurred. This doesn't explain much. And where the subtlety, where the beautiful elegance of this model comes in, is now we transition over to the B part of the diagram, because it's a little more complicated than what I showed you. Now we've got a second neuron on the scene, neuron Y, also found in your spinal cord. Neuron Y sends a projection to neuron X. And what neuron Y does is it inhibits the activity of neuron X. It makes neuron X less excitable. So look at what's happening. Back to the sudden pain pathway up on top. Your sudden pain-oriented receptors responding to things like a cut get activated and, as we just saw, send that signal to neuron X and stimulates it. And you feel pain. But at the same time, that same sudden pain neuron up on top has a collateral, a cable that comes off, which also sends a projection to neuron Y and stimulates it. So what happens here? The pain receptive neuron up on top gets stimulated by something painful and stimulates neuron Y and X at the same time. And then with a slight delay, neuron Y turns off neuron X. And what have you just explained? Why you get a sharp, piercing pain, which then goes away shortly afterward. You touch a pot that's hot and you pull your finger back, you get a paper cut and it suddenly hurts and then it goes away. And that's all due to the fact that with a delay, neuron Y is turning off neuron X after that excitation. Meanwhile, still in diagram B, underneath, you've got that slow pain pathway when some pain-evoking stimulus that we tend to subjectively feel as being slow activates that neuron, as we saw before. The projection comes in and stimulates neuron X. You're feeling pain. And just like before, that same neuron has a branch, a collateral going off to neuron Y. But this time, what that collateral does is it inhibits the activity of neuron Y. So what happens? Something painful occurs, activates neuron X, which gets excited, sending a pain signal. And what you're also doing there is you're shutting down neuron Y, which makes it impossible for neuron Y to shut down neuron X. What happens? The pain keeps going. It throbs. This is what chronic throbbing pain is about. So two very different pathways that are pulled out of this diagram. Now, this begins to explain a couple of really interesting things. What this tells you is, suppose you've got a throbbing chronic pain, which is neuron X is activated and neuron Y doesn't have the means to silence neuron X. What would you love to do? Let's stimulate Y so it kicks in and shuts off X. When is that going on? You have a chronic pain, which is what itching is in some circumstances. You've got some horrible itchy mosquito bite. And what do we often do? Don't scratch the mosquito bite. It will get infected. What you do instead is you scratch on either side of it. And what you're doing is you're stimulating that sudden pain pathway, which stimulates Y, which silences X, and the itchiness goes away for a little bit. Another example of this. Suppose you have a chronic pain, throbbing, coming from that lower slow pain pathway, and you want to make it go away, some throbbing pain in your muscles. What do? You go get somebody to pound on your back hard, give you a massage. Because what is done with a really aggressive massaging is you stimulate those acute pain pathways, which activates Y to silence X. Even more examples. You've got a condition where somebody has a lot of trouble delivering energy to cells throughout the body. We heard about that earlier. That's what juvenile diabetes is about. And as a result of that energy depletion, some of your cells begin to die. And for very complex reasons, in a pathway like this, it's the sudden pain pathway neurons that die. What's the consequence of this? You turn on a slow pain pathway, and Y shuts down, and X keeps screaming its head off for long afterward, and it just keeps going and going because you can never shut down that signal with a sharp input. What have you got? Diabetic neuropathy, the fact that pain there just goes on and on. So here we've seen the basic wiring of the system. So how does it begin to play out? There's all sorts of interesting things that happen that underlie an important fact there, which is pain is not that objective of a state. There's a lot of subjectivity that comes into pain perception. For example, you can have a circumstance where you feel pain and there's not even a stimulus, a painful stimulus happening. And a lot of us feel that pain, which is when you're in the dentist chair and the person so much as walks in the room and your teeth are aching. There was no stimulus there. And if you're really hypersensitive, you feel throbbing pain in your gums there simply by hearing the music going on in the office. So that could be a source where, with no actual stimulus, you're feeling pain. Some of those neurons are sending messages up to your brain when there was nothing that stimulated them. Another example, you sit there and instead of experiencing some pure, overt, realistic pain stimulus, hot, cold, whatever, you sit there and you watch the same thing being done to a loved one and you feel their pain. On a certain level, the feeling of pain as an empathetic response, that taps into the same wiring here. As we'll see in a coming lecture, there's another example of this. Clinical depression appears to involve overactivation of a couple of these pain pathways. In other words, psychic pain even has some reality in terms of wiring. So some of the time, you can turn on a pain response when there's absolutely no stimulus. Some of the time, there can be a pain stimulus, and you don't even notice it. And let me give you a highly technical example. Suppose somebody takes some really rough sandpaper and unexpectedly sandpapers your rear end over and over, abrading it. This is likely to seem unpleasant. Suppose instead, in some rare abstract scenario, you are abrading your rear end exactly the same way, having enthusiastic sex while on a carpet or whatever, and you don't even notice it. Context makes a huge difference. And then there's some settings where you not only don't notice the pain, where you actually give a subjective interpretation that the pain is good news. Some very poignant examples. First one, you have some soldier in battle that is utterly terrifying, people getting killed left and right, and the person gets shot in their leg. It hurts. This is not a fatal wound. It hurts, and why could this be good news? This means they're injured. They're out of this war. They're being sent to the back lines. This hurts like crazy, but here's the wonderful news. I'm going to survive. Or another example that is quite poignant as well, and this is someone I happen to know with a very serious type of cancer, and at some point they tried an experimental drug. It wasn't quite clear if it was going to work, and if it did work, if this drug started killing some of the tumor cells, things were going to hurt like crazy as those cells died. And a few weeks into it, yes, indeed, fortunately, this therapy was working, and talking to this friend saying, well, how's this feel? And the response being, it hurts like hell, and that's the greatest news I could possibly get. This is the sign that it's working. So there's this tremendous element of subjectivity going on in there. And how might that subjectivity work? We will see the wiring for that shortly, but what you know is going on in there is your brain isn't just getting signals from your spinal cord. Your brain is sending signals down to your spinal cord. Okay, so a bit more about the wiring. You hit one of those painful stimuli, and it is activating the sudden acute pain pathway or the throbbing dull one. Part of what happens then is exclusively in your spinal cord. You've got reflexes where a pain signal comes in, and an instant later, the spinal cord is sending a message to the relevant muscles, get your foot out of that fire. You are not sitting there consciously saying, well, that sure feels aversive, and in fact, my toe is roasting. This might be a good time to send a message. Let's see, was it my left toe, big toe, or my right one? Let's send a message there telling it to retract. It's purely spinal reflex. So that's a first level of analysis of a painful input. The next is going on in the brain. And it's a level of the brain, a very ancient part of the brain, that's telling you objective information about the source of pain. It's telling you how painful the pain is. It's telling you where the pain is coming from. This is your painometer, telling you how many units of ouchness you've gotten there. This is one that is sending up information saying it's your foot, not your hand, that's gotten injured. This is a bad one. This is a moderate one, whatever. And this activates parts of the brain, which in turn tell other parts to make you start breathing faster and your heart to speed up and maybe to whimper and some of your blood vessels there to constrict, all sorts of autonomic nervous system stuff. So that's a bit of wiring that's in common to all sorts of species out there, including us. Then there's a level on top of it. And this is not the painometer, ancient part of your brain, measuring how many of your toes feel miserable. This is forebrain, more recently evolved parts of the brain, your cortex, in particular an area called the frontal cortex. And what that one plays a role in is evaluating the pain, telling you what you think about it, how you feel about it. And as soon as you're in a world of people who are being in great amounts of pain is wonderful news because they're out of the war, where looking at their loved one feels painful. When you're up there, this is not the painometer part of the brain. This is that forebrain, that frontal cortex, doing evaluative stuff. What does this pain information mean? Now, in order for that to work, we have to return to that diagram, which is in the guidebook, and now we see a very important elaboration. What we've just gone through are circumstances where pain, those parts of the brain that give the subjective evaluative notion of what the pain is about, changes your pain perception. In other words, not only, as promised, is the brain getting pain information coming from the periphery, the brain is sending information back out to the periphery. And as you can see in the diagram here, part C, we've now added in an additional element. We've got the sudden pain inputs, the slow pain inputs, neuron Y, neuron X. Neuron X, when activated, sending information up to the brain, the stuff we all know. But now what we also see is the possibility of projections coming down the spine from the brain. some of which stimulate neuron X, and suddenly the Muzak in the dentist's office is making you feel miserable. Some of it coming down, inhibiting neuron X, the evaluative stuff. This is great news. I'm out of the war now. So what we have here is this bidirectionality. Your brain is influencing how sensitive those neurons are to a painful input. So this is the basic wiring about how pain works. So what does stress do on top of it? We've already heard a bit about this in the very first lecture. Massive, painful, stressful stimulus, and this is our zebra with its innards ripped out by the predator. And one of the things that happens is, blessedly, pain perception gets blunted somewhat. Stress-induced analgesia. Analgesia, the inability to feel pain. Severe stress can block some pain perception. And this pops up, this has been documented in all sorts of fascinating ways. For example, you get people who are involved in a serious car accident, and what the literature shows is, above a certain degree of seriousness, 80% of them need morphine as a painkiller. Meanwhile, you look at soldiers in the middle of a battle who get the exact same severity of injury, and the percentage that need the morphine is vastly lower. What's that about? You have a car accident that comes from out of nowhere, excruciating pain. You get the same injury in the middle of a battle, and the stress of that battle has been producing a roaringly effective case of stress-induced analgesia. And there's much more commonplace circumstances where the same thing happens. You're in the middle of the annual company volleyball game, and you come down and you twist your ankle, and you don't feel it quite as much. That's because, in this case, the stress of the physical activity has induced a certain degree of stress-induced analgesia. So that's a mighty useful thing if you are running away from that lion and you've got that bad injury. How does it work? What are the mechanisms underlying that? And it's actually quite well understood, and a big piece of it has to do with the stress hormone we've heard about a lot in some recent lectures, beta endorphins. Remember, I brought up that point, beta endorphins, they have something to do with pain, but weirdly, here's yet another hormone chemical messenger that does more than one thing. It's got something to do with reproduction, all of that. Now we get to the central arena of what beta endorphin does. And again, going back to its name, what the source of it is, endorphin, endogenous morphine. Beta endorphin is the drug that blocks the pain perception, the chemical messenger. And we can once again go back to that diagram, to part C, and you look at those projections coming down from the brain. Look at the bottom one, the one that inhibits neuron X, the one that makes neuron X less likely to activate, the one that blunts pain perception. Almost certainly in a lot of these circuits, that projection from the brain makes use of endorphins to block the pain perception. And that's great. That begins to account for the reason why most people who know what beta endorphin is about understand what it does, which is the famed runner's high, your endorphin high. You go out and you decide to run some long distance, and it hurts, and you're miserable, and you're dizzy, and you're ready to keel over. And somewhere around 10, 20 minutes into it, suddenly you get this wonderful, gauzy sense of well-being, and it's great. And that's when the endorphins kick in. Mind you, the next day you're going to be miserably sore, but for the moment at least, that's where it's coming from. There's also evidence that acupuncture, when it blocks pain perception, is doing so by stimulating endorphin release. There's also evidence that placebo effects, when one is faked into thinking that you've blocked pain, you're putting a painful stimulus, say something hot on your fingertip, and the subjects are told that they're putting on a cream which blocks pain perception. It actually doesn't really do that. It just causes a placebo effect, and you feel less pain there. And what that placebo effect appears to be about, in a lot of cases, is activating those descending beta endorphin pathways. This finger is screaming with the exact same painful, hot stimulus, and your brain is saying, hey, that doesn't really hurt, because after all, we've got this new analgesic cream on our fingertip. That's the brain sending that message down to the neuron X, almost certainly using beta endorphin as the pathway. So now we come into, instead of the realm of acute stress and the activation of beta endorphin and that whole sort of pathway and the acute tapping into that circuit, now what about chronic stress? What about massive chronic stress? And what we get to is truly bad news. Let us return to that diagram yet again. What happens with sustained stress? Major stress is really unpleasant, which is a lot of stimulation of pain pathways make pain pathways more sensitive, more responsive, so that pain begets pain. And you have a phenomenon of hyperalgesia, which is where you have enhanced pain sensitivity. There are some horrible clinical disorders where there's problems in the nervous system, the sort of wiring we've been looking at, where those neurons just fire spontaneously, and thus you are constantly in pain, the hyperalgesia. But one of the things that chronic stress can do is increase the excitability of those neurons. And at an extreme, what you wind up getting is a neuron that actually keeps stimulating itself. Let's look once again at neuron X, and we've already seen the possibility that a neuron sends its primary projection and then has one of those collateral things that come off. What you can sometimes see is something like a neuron X forms a collateral that loops back on itself, and every time neuron X gets stimulated, it stimulates itself more and more hyperalgesia. And where stress appears to come in, making this possible, is what we've heard about already, the capacity of acute stressors to activate the innate immune response. You remember that from a few lectures ago, to cause inflammation. Inflammation makes pain-mediating neurons more excitable and more likely to get into this vicious circle of pain activation causing pain activation causing pain activation. So now back to where this lecture started, which was going through our usual dichotomy, short-term good news, long-term bad news, and also going back to the very first lecture, going through that notion of Selye's, which turned out to be wrong. Why is it that chronic stress makes you sick? And he came up with that completely incorrect idea that with chronic stress you go into the exhaustion phase. You run out of the hormones of the stress response. You are depleted of adrenaline, epinephrine. You're depleted of this or that hormone related to stress, and you are pummeled there. And as we saw, this doesn't happen. There is no organism on Earth that has been so stressed that it runs out of adrenaline. It simply doesn't happen.